we've agreed on 4 principles that I think are important. The first is that we're going to appoint our teams respectively that have worked very quickly to reestablish the functionality of our respective missions in Washington and in Moscow. For us to be able to continue to move down this road, we need to have diplomatic facilities that are operating and functioning normally. The second point is that we're going to appoint a high-level team from our end to help negotiate and work through the end of the conflict in Ukraine in a way that's enduring and acceptable to all the parties engaged. The third point is to begin to work at a high level as well to begin to discuss and think about and examine both the geopolitical and economic cooperation that could result from an end to the conflict in Ukraine. Obviously, we have to see that conflict come to a successful and enduring end in order for that to be possible. And the last thing we agreed to is that while our teams are going to be working on all of this, the 4 of us who were here today, the 5 of us that were here today, are going to remain engaged in this process to make sure that it's moving along in a productive way.
What does an enduring and successful end look like? Did you present any proposals to the Russians today?
Well, there's some underlying principles. This needs to be a permanent end to the war. And not a temporary end as we've seen in the past. We know just the practical reality is that there is going to be some discussion of territory and there's going to be discussion of security guarantees. Those are just fundamental basics that will undergird and underlie any type of discussion. But I think the most important part is the President has stated his desire, his determination to end this war, to end the killing that is going on, the death and destruction that is happening as this war, goes on and on, month after month after month, in the killing fields of eastern and southern Ukraine is unacceptable. It is not in the interest of either country. It's not in the interest of the world, and certainly not in the interest of the United States and Europe. So all of those things will drive the negotiations going forward. And as you can see, President Trump is determined to move very quickly. We just had a head of state phone call, the first in years, and here we are less than a week later at the highest level of the U.S. and Russian government, and we expect to continue to drive that pace to not only end the war, but then to unlock what could be very productive and stabilizing relationships going forward.
You mentioned territory. Is it acceptable to the U.S. for Russia to retain any territory that is annexed since the beginning of the war in February 2022?
Well, I think those are things that those are to be discussed, and those are things that will start and do the tough work ahead. But the important thing is that we've started that process. And what the President did not find acceptable was an endless war in Europe that was literally has turned into a meat grinder of people on both sides. So if you just think about, just in a few months, President Trump has shifted the entire global conversation from not if the war is going to end, but just how it's going to end. And only President Trump can do that. And in the Oval Office less than a week ago, both President Putin and President Zelensky both said to him, only you, President Trump, could drive this war to a conclusion.
What concessions do you expect?
Well, again, we're not going to pre-negotiate an end to this conflict. These are the kinds of things that have to happen through hard and difficult diplomacy in closed rooms over a period of time. What's important to understand is 2 things. The first is the only leader in the world who can make this happen, who can even bring people together to begin to talk about it in a serious way, is President Trump. He's the only one in the world that can do that right now. The second thing I would say is that in order for a conflict to end, everyone involved in that conflict has to be okay with it. It has to be acceptable to them. But we have to understand that it's been 3.5 years since there's been any sort of regularized contact between the United States and Russia, and in some cases between any of the participants in this conflict and Russia. So the goal of today's meeting was to follow up on the phone call the President had a week ago and begin to establish those lines of communication. The work remains. Today is the first step of a long and difficult journey, but an important one. And President Trump is committed to bringing an end to this conflict, and as he said when he campaigned for president. And he wants it to end in a way that's fair. He wants it to end in a way that's sustainable and enduring, not that leads to another conflict in 2 to 3 years. That's not going to be easy to achieve, but he's the only one in the world that can begin that process. Donald Trump is the only leader in the world that could initiate that process, and today was a first step in that process.
Is sanctions relief going to be involved in any of this normalizing or trying to more level set the relationship between the U.S. and Russia? Did the Russians bring up sanctions relief in the meeting today?
Well, sanctions are all the result of this conflict. There are sanctions that were imposed as a result of this conflict. And so I would say to you that in order to bring an end to any conflict, there has to be concessions made by all sides. We're not going to predetermine what those are. We're certainly not going to negotiate this today or in a press conference for that matter. But, and there are other parties that have sanctions. The European Union is going to have to be at the table at some point because they have sanctions as well that have been imposed. So, but I guess the point here is the goal is, and we agreed on what the goal is to bring an end to this conflict in a way that's fair, enduring, sustainable, and acceptable to all parties involved. What that looks like, well, that's what the ongoing engagement is going to be all about.
The Ukrainians and the Europeans have suggested they feel very sidelined about how the process has played out so far. How do you intend to address their concerns? And will they be incorporated in future meetings in a multilateral way?
Well, the comment I would have on that is that for 3.5 years while this conflict has raged, or 3 years while it's raged, no one else has been able to bring something together like what we saw today, because Donald Trump is the only leader in the world that can. So no one is being sidelined here. But President Trump is in a position that he campaigned on to initiate a process that could bring about an end to this conflict. And from that could emerge some very positive things for the United States, for Europe, for Ukraine, for the world. But first it begins by the end of this conflict. And so the only thing President Trump's trying to do is bring about peace. It's what he campaigned on. It's something the world should be thanking President Trump for doing. He's been able to achieve what for 2.5, 3 years no one else has been able to achieve, which is to begin this process, a serious process. Obviously, a lot of work remains before we have a result, but President Trump's the only one that can do it.
Look, it's common sense. If you're going to bring both sides together, you have to talk to both sides. And we'll continue to remind everyone, literally within minutes of President Trump hanging up with President Putin, he called and spoke with President Zelensky. So shuttle diplomacy has happened throughout history. It's happened all over the world. We are absolutely talking to both sides. The Secretary of State just met with President Zelensky days ago, along with the Vice President, 7 cabinet members in Europe at the same time, really showing the importance of engaging our allies. President Trump spoke with President Macron just yesterday. Prime Minister Starmer is coming to Washington next week. So I think the facts will continue to push back on this notion that our allies haven't been consulted. They are being consulted literally almost on a daily basis, and will continue to do so.
Did you set a date for the two presidents to meet at this meeting? When can we expect that meeting?
We did not. We did not set that date, but the two presidents talked about meeting and expect to meet.
Can you take us a little bit in the room today? What was the interaction like? How would you characterize the discussions?
It was positive, upbeat, constructive. Everybody there to get to the right outcome, solution-based. We discussed it afterwards. We couldn't have imagined a better result after this session. It was very, very solid.
Will you be traveling to Russia again, Mr. Witkoff?
I'm not sure, but we'll make that determination in the next couple of weeks.
The Europeans, Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, has said the U.S. needs to back any sort of European solution to the war. Is this something that you are willing to commit to?
Well, I think that's something that we'll continue to discuss. We have certainly, again, as a first principle, a European-led security guarantee. We have the President, many of us, as members of prior members of Congress ourselves, have called for the Europeans to continue to contribute to our common defense, to continue to share the burden of NATO defense. We'll continue to point out that while things have improved, starting with President Trump's first term, the fact that 1/3 of our NATO allies still do not contribute the minimum of 2% of their GDP to defense a decade after that we all collectively made that agreement isn't acceptable. We have the NATO summit coming up this June, and we would expect with the type of conflict, the type of warfare and destruction we've seen in Europe, sadly, the last several years, that we have 100% at the minimum, and in fact are exceeding that. So, look, this is a common effort. This isn't just about what the United States is going to continue to contribute and what we are going to continue to ask of the American taxpayer. We all have to make those tough decisions. We all have to contribute to our common defense, and we expect that this to be a two-way street for our European allies. And the fact that both the United Kingdom, France, and others are talking about contributing more forcefully to Ukraine's security, we think is a good thing.
Did you walk away from this meeting convinced the Russians want peace? You said it might take some time to be convinced of that. How are you seeing it now?
I mean, I don't view diplomacy that way. I think diplomacy ultimately is based on actions. It's based on commitments that are kept. So I think I came away today convinced that they are willing to begin to engage in a serious process to determine how and how quickly and through what mechanism can an end be brought to this war. Whether we can ultimately reach that outcome will obviously depend on every side in this conflict's willingness to agree to certain things. So I think it's important to have this meeting because we haven't really had much engagement with the Russians for almost 3 years. And it sets the table for future conversations. How that turns out will be up to the parties and their willingness not just to make commitments but to live by them. That'll be tested in the weeks to come. But I can tell you again, as I reiterate, President Trump has made it very clear during the campaign he thought this conflict needed to end. He's the only leader in the world that could have started a process that we saw here today, and this process is going to continue. And when you talk about an enduring and sustainable end to the conflict, it means one that's acceptable to everyone involved in it. And that obviously includes Ukraine, but also our partners in Europe, and of course the Russian side as well.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in there, but I just wanted to also take a moment, I think on behalf of all of us and the President, to thank our partners in Saudi Arabia, to thank our hosts for bringing this together, and particularly the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his team. We are moving quickly, which means they moved very quickly to be such gracious hosts, and we certainly are all appreciative.
Absolutely.
As a last question, will the Saudis take on a more active mediation role as these talks move forward?
Well, that's a decision for the kingdom to make, but I can tell you that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is playing an indispensable role in making today possible. Not just hosting us, but bringing the parties together to have these conversations. I think it's something we're very grateful for, something we're very grateful for the partnership that we have with them on a host of issues, and this being one of them, where we thank them for doing it, and we hope that they will, I think they've offered, and I believe that they will continue to be helpful in any way they can.
Thanks.
I'll be extremely brief. So what is the next step now? The high-level team you mentioned is number 2 or number 3.
Yeah, so let me walk you through the next step is multi-track. The first next step is working through our respective teams at the diplomatic side just to ensure that our diplomatic missions can function. There's been a series of reciprocal actions taken over the last 10 years that have really diminished our ability to operate in Moscow, as an example, and they would argue their ability to operate in Washington. We're going to need to have vibrant diplomatic missions that are able to function normally in order to be able to continue these conduits. The second is a high-level team, including those who are experts on these topics, the technical side, to begin to engage with their side on parameters of what an end to this conflict would look like. And on that front, obviously, there's going to be engagement and consultation with Ukraine, with our partners in Europe and others. But ultimately, the Russian side will be indispensable to this effort, and so that process will begin. And then the third is, together with those other two, is beginning to engage in identifying the extraordinary opportunities that exist should this conflict come to an acceptable end, the credible opportunities that exist to partner with the Russians geopolitically on issues of common interest, and frankly economically on issues that hopefully will be good for the world and will also improve our relations in the long term between these two important countries. So all three of those efforts will be happening in conjunction with one another. Obviously, the diplomatic one is one we hope to move pretty quickly on, because this involves the treatment of our respective missions. The second one will be difficult, which is the question of Ukraine and the end of that conflict. But I think that's essential in order for the third piece to even be possible, which is our ability to work together on other geopolitical matters of common interest, and of course, some pretty unique, potentially historic economic partnerships as well. The key that unlocks the door for those opportunities, however, is the end to this conflict.
But Brett, in terms of when does the high-level team meet? Has there been any date?
There's no date set, but yes, President Trump is, as you've seen over the last 4 weeks, not patient in terms of getting action. He drives hard, he wants to get things done. He's been wanting to do this, and he's moving very quickly to fulfill the promises he made to the American people when they elected him as our president.
Okay, and then in terms of number one, in the restoration of the diplomatic missions, you'll remember that the first big tit of the tit for tats was after the Skripal poisoning, and the U.S. under one of your predecessors, Mr. Tillerson, expelled a lot of Russian diplomats, to which they responded. The consulate in St. Petersburg got closed down by the Russians. You guys closed down the consulate in Seattle, and several others. Are those going to be open?
Well, that's what we're going to be talking about. And but ultimately, again, I'm not going to negotiate or work on that in public. That's what these channels will be about. But ultimately, what the goal we need to have is we have to have some normalcy in our missions and in their ability to function.
And the main embassies even.
And in the main
just
embassies
the main
in
embassies,
particular.
regardless of the consulates.
I mean, if our diplomatic channels are broken, it's going to be very difficult to consistently engage on a host of topics, including some unrelated irritants that could derail the broader talks on Ukraine. So there has to be some improvement in the way our missions are able to work and in the environment and space that they're given to operate in. So that's something we want to move on quickly, and it's important to set the table for the other two things that we want to do. But I think the key really in all of this is ultimately going to be whether an agreement can be reached with all parties involved on an acceptable resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. Because if that happens, not only will the world be a better place, but I think there will be some pretty unique opportunities to work with them on areas of bilateral geopolitical interest and some very unique economic opportunities. But we have to get the Ukraine situation resolved first in a way that's acceptable to everyone.
Okay, my last one. But does that mean if you get the staffs back to the normal operational level and staff at the embassies, that you consider the Skripal case, the Crimea annexation, to be closed? There are no longer issues? Because I think, you mentioned that Keir Starmer is going to be in Washington next week. I can imagine that the Brits won't be particularly...
Yeah, again, I'm not going to negotiate or talk through every element of the disruptions that exist or have existed in our diplomatic relations and the mechanics of it. Suffice it to say that President Trump has pledged and intends to keep his promise to do everything he can to bring an end to this conflict. We cannot do that unless we have at least some normalcy in the way our diplomatic missions operate in Moscow and in Washington, D.C. And so we need to work to improve that, and we're going to work with them to see what's possible within that context.
Does that include removing Lavrov from rescinding sanctions that have been imposed?
We're just not at that level of conversation yet, but so there'll be a number of topics that will have to be discussed along the way. We haven't even begun that process. Today was just an agreement to begin a process to talk about those things.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Take you in the room. You are in the room.
On Capitol Hill, the U.S. Senate gavels in